A woman was burning alive inside her overturned SUV when a U.S. veteran and his German shepherd appeared out of the storm,
Give me your hand!
saving her
Quick, get
seconds
out!
before the explosion.
Help me!
But by sunrise,
I'm stuck.
the hero was fired, the truth was buried, and someone at the harbor wanted him destroyed. What really happened at Warehouse 17? Coldwater Bay was a harsh place on nights when the Pacific decided to roar. The storm rolled across the coastline like a living beast, slamming waves against the battered guardrails that lined the narrow coastal highway. The entire town, small, blue-collar, framed by rugged pine forests and the scent of salt, seemed to shrink beneath the violence of wind and rain. Lightning flashed in jagged streaks, illuminating the wet asphalt long enough to show how empty and unforgiving the road was. In the distance, the harbor cranes creaked like old bones in the wind, while the surrounding trees bent low as if pleading for mercy. It was the kind of night that kept most people inside. But not Jim Walker. Jim Walker, a 50-year-old U.S. veteran with a broad, worn frame and the quiet posture of a man who had carried too many burdens, drove his old Ford truck down the winding road from his secluded log cabin in the woods. Years of deployments had carved faint lines around his eyes, giving him a perpetual look of focus and resolve. His hair was short and streaked with gray, his jaw strong but shadowed with stubble, and his hands, scarred, steady, gripped the steering wheel as if ready for whatever came next. The storm did not intimidate him. War and loss had hardened him long before the skies ever did. But even he felt the weight of this night. Beside him sat Rex, his 4-year-old German shepherd, a muscular sable-coated dog with alert amber eyes and a black saddle that seemed to darken whenever he sensed danger. Rex had been trained as a combat K-9, and though he was young, he carried himself with the discipline of a seasoned soldier. His ears twitched at every crack of thunder, but it wasn't fear. It was calculation. Rex had a calm, sharp intelligence, the kind Jim trusted more than most people. Tonight the dog sat upright, breathing heavier than usual, gaze fixed on the road ahead. Jim glanced at him and murmured, "Easy, buddy. We're just heading to work." But deep down, he knew Rex never reacted like this unless something was coming. Jim was heading to the night shift at Warehouse 17, a massive storage facility perched at the edge of Coldwater Bay's shipping district. It was a lonely job, supervising the overnight security of cargo crates, forklifts, and the endless groaning machinery of the port. But Jim preferred solitude. After the war, crowds made him uneasy, and silence, broken only by the ocean's distant roar, felt safer. As the truck climbed a curve overlooking the dark sea, Rex suddenly growled, low and long, a sound Jim recognized instantly. It was the growl Rex used overseas moments before danger struck, the kind of sound that saved lives. Jim tightened his grip on the wheel. "What is it, boy?" A flash of lightning ripped across the sky, and for a split second, Jim saw it. A vehicle skidding sideways on the slick highway. A black SUV spun like a loose coin, careening violently across the road before crashing nose first into the guardrail. The impact sent sparks exploding from the hood, and the sound of twisting metal cut through the storm. The SUV flipped partially onto its side, steam hissing from the crushed engine. Jim slammed his brakes, the truck fishtailing briefly before stopping. Rex barked sharply, urgency replacing warning. Jim shoved his door open, rain beating against him like icy needles as he sprinted toward the wreck. Inside the SUV, through the shattered side window, he saw her. An older woman, perhaps in her mid-60s, her silver bob hair plastered across her pale face. She wore a red wool coat torn at the shoulder and a dark green scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She had refined features, high cheekbones, elegant posture even in panic, but was trembling violently, her hands clawing at the jammed seatbelt. Her eyes, a soft gray blue, were wide with terror. She flinched hard every time thunder cracked, reacting with a fear that seemed older than the crash itself. Jim recognized that kind of fear, the kind tied to past trauma. "Ma'am, I'm coming," he shouted through the storm. Jim grabbed the door handle, but the metal had twisted from the impact. He braced his boots against the wet pavement and pulled with all his strength, muscles straining as the storm lashed around him. The door wouldn't budge. Rex circled the vehicle, barking sharply, each bark louder than the last as flames flickered beneath the hood. Smoke began seeping through the cracks in the grille. "Hang on," Jim growled. He repositioned, wedged his shoulder beneath the door's edge, and used pure force to bend the frame outward. Metal groaned, screaming against the strain. A small gap formed. Just enough. Jim shoved his arm in, unlatched the seatbelt, and pulled the woman toward him. The woman's voice trembled as she clung to him. "Please, please get me out." She winced at every rumble of thunder, her entire body jolting like she was reliving something she had spent years trying to forget. Jim lifted her as though she weighed nothing, surprised by how light and fragile she felt. She smelled faintly of lavender and burnt fabric. Rex stayed close, moving backwards to guide them away from the vehicle. Just as they cleared the crash site, a violent explosion erupted from the SUV's engine, flames bursting upward like a fiery wave. The woman let out a strangled cry and buried her face into Jim's chest. He shielded her with his body until the sparks settled. Once the danger lessened, Jim carried her to his truck, helping her into the passenger seat while Rex jumped into the back. Rainwater streamed down both of them as Jim slammed the door shut. The woman gasped for breath, clutching her coat as if trying to hold herself together. "My name is Eleanor." "Eleanor Hayes," she whispered, her voice elegant despite the tremor. Jim nodded calmly. "I'm Jim. This is Rex. You're safe now." But she wasn't. Not fully. Her hands still shook, uncontrollably, her skin clammy from shock. Jim saw this before in civilians caught in bombings overseas. He turned the heater on full and looked her in the eyes. "I'm taking you to the hospital." Driving through the storm again, Jim kept one hand on the wheel and the other ready to steady Eleanor if she slipped. She trembled violently each time thunder cracked, mumbling fragmented memories of a storm decades ago, a storm that stole her husband and son. Jim didn't press her. He only nodded, understanding in silence. Rex watched her with deep, intelligent eyes, sensing her fragility, and lowering his head near her lap as if offering reassurance. When they finally reached the emergency entrance of Coldwater Bay Medical Center, Jim lifted her out of the truck and carried her inside. Nurses rushed toward them immediately, and as the storm raged outside, Jim realized one thing. This night and this woman were going to change everything. The hospital's automatic doors slid shut behind Jim Walker as he stepped back into the storm-soaked night. His boots left wet prints on the pavement while the red emergency lights reflected off every puddle around him. Rex, his 4-year-old German shepherd, shook the rain off his sable coat, tail lowered but alert as always. Jim checked the clock on his truck's dashboard. He was already 20 minutes behind. His shift at Warehouse 17 had started without him, and the port was unforgiving about lateness. Jim exhaled sharply, a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline still buzzing in his veins after rescuing Eleanor Hayes. He turned the key, and the engine grumbled awake as he sped toward Coldwater Bay's shipping district. The drive to the harbor was a blur of rain-slicked streets and distant foghorns echoing from container ships anchored offshore. Jim's body ached, his shoulders stiff from pulling Eleanor out of the SUV, but he pushed the pain aside. The port grew larger as he approached, its massive cranes towering like iron skeletons beneath the angry clouds. Floodlights cast long shadows across stacks of cargo containers, and the metallic scent of salt and diesel thickened the air. Rex stood with his front paws on the dashboard, ears perked, watching every movement on the darkened docks. He sensed tension. Not danger, but something close. A stiffness in his posture said he understood Jim was walking into a confrontation. Warehouse 17 loomed ahead, a huge steel structure with flickering lights, paint peeling along its sides from years of ocean storms. As Jim parked, he saw a group of night shift workers huddled near the loading bay. Among them was Carlos Vega, a young forklift operator in his mid-20s with curly black hair, warm brown eyes, and a nervous habit of rubbing the back of his neck when anxious. Carlos respected Jim deeply. Jim had once stopped a forklift from tipping onto him months earlier, and Carlos never forgot it. When he saw Jim approaching in the rain, he stepped forward. "Man, Frank is in a mood tonight. You should have seen him pacing," he whispered. Jim gave a tired nod. "Thanks. Let's see how bad it is." Inside the warehouse, the noise of engines and conveyor belts echoed like a machine orchestra. Pallets rattled, forklifts beeped in reverse, and workers shouted brief instructions over the din. Standing in the middle of the chaos was Frank Dalton, the night shift supervisor. Frank was in his late 40s, tall but slightly overweight, with a square jaw that carried a permanent scowl. He had thinning blonde hair slicked back with too much gel, and small, unforgiving eyes that judged everyone before they opened their mouths. He wore a reflective vest stretched tight around his stomach, and he gripped a clipboard as if it was a weapon. Frank had never liked Jim, a veteran who didn't bow to intimidation. And tonight, Frank smelled opportunity. As Jim approached, Frank's lips curled into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Look who finally decided to show up," he said loudly enough for nearby workers to hear. His voice carried an edge of satisfaction, like he'd been waiting for this moment. Jim remained calm, water dripping from his military cold-weather parka. "There was a car accident," he explained evenly. "An elderly woman was trapped. I pulled her out and took her to the hospital." Instead of showing concern, Frank scoffed. "Oh, here we go. Another heroic story from the great Jim Walker." Several workers looked away, uncomfortable. They respected Jim, but Frank's power over their schedules kept them silent. Frank stepped closer, invading Jim's space. His breath smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. "You're 20 minutes late," he snapped. "And I don't care if you rescued the entire town. We run on discipline here, not excuses." Jim kept his voice steady. "You know I've never been late before. Not once." Frank raised his eyebrows mockingly. "Congratulations. Want a medal?" Rex stepped forward, teeth slightly bared. The German shepherd's amber eyes locked on Frank with a cold warning. Frank tensed immediately. "Get that mutt under control," he barked. Jim placed a calm hand on Rex's back. "Rex reacts to hostility," he said. "Maybe try lowering yours." The tension snapped. Frank's face turned red, and he jabbed his pen at Jim's chest. "You're fired," he spat. "Effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the nearby workers. Even the forklifts seemed to pause. Jim stood still, absorbing the words without flinching. He had survived harsher confrontations in war zones. Frank continued, savoring each syllable. "Hand over your access badge. Now." Jim removed the badge from his parka, placing it into Frank's palm. Frank held it up like a trophy. "This is what happens when you think you're above the rules," he sneered. Rex growled deeper this time, tail stiff, ready to protect. Carlos stepped forward, voice trembling. "Come on, Frank. He literally saved someone's life. Everyone knows Jim's solid." Frank spun toward him. "You want to join him? Because I can make that happen." Carlos immediately fell silent, shoulders shrinking. His eyes filled with guilt as he met Jim's calm gaze. Jim gave a small nod as if to reassure him. It wasn't his fault. Another worker, a middle-aged dockhand named Patrick Sloan with a salt and pepper beard and oil-stained gloves, muttered under his breath, "This ain't right." But Frank's glare froze him too. Fear outweighed fairness. Jim took a steady breath. "If that's your decision, I'll go." His voice held no anger, only quiet disappointment. He turned toward the entrance, boots echoing across the concrete. Rex followed, staying close to Jim's leg, glancing back at Frank with a soldier's distrust. Frank called after them. "And don't bother coming back. Security will escort you off the grounds if you try." Jim didn't respond. He didn't need to. The judgment spoke for itself. Rain clattered loudly as he pushed open the warehouse doors. The storm outside seemed gentler than the one he had walked through moments earlier. Outside, Carlos hurried after him, despite the risk. "Jim, I'm sorry," he said, voice strained. "Frank's been itching to get rid of you for months. I don't know why." Jim placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "Not your fault. You stay safe in there." Rex nuzzled Carlos's hand softly, sensing his distress. Carlos gave a grateful half smile. "You're a good man, Jim. You don't deserve this." Jim nodded once more, then turned toward the parking lot, rain running down his coat like tiny rivers. As Jim reached his truck, he paused, gripping the door handle. Rex stood beside him, posture alert but no longer aggressive. Jim looked back at Warehouse 17, its harsh lights, its towering steel frame, and the silhouette of Frank Dalton inside acting like he controlled the whole harbor. Jim exhaled long and deep. "Come on, buddy," he said quietly. "Our night's not over yet." Rex nudged his hand with loyalty carved into every movement. Together they stepped into the truck, leaving the warehouse and the injustice behind them for now. The soft rhythm of hospital machines brought Eleanor Hayes back from the blurred edge of unconsciousness. Morning light filtered through the curtains, turning her room into a pale, gentle haze. Eleanor, 65 years old, with her elegant silver bob and refined facial features, blinked several times before her surroundings sharpened. Her body ached with every breath, reminders of the crash she narrowly survived. But her mind snapped to clarity the moment she remembered the storm, the explosion, and the man, quiet, strong, steady, who had pulled her from the burning SUV. Eleanor's heartbeat picked up. Her first words, barely a whisper, were, "Where is the man who saved me?" A young nurse entered, a petite woman with warm brown skin and tightly curled hair tied in a bun. Her badge read, Nurse Amelia Brooks, a 28-year-old caregiver with expressive eyes and a gentle, reassuring smile. She carried an air of calm competence shaped by years of night shifts, and seeing both tragedy and resilience. When Eleanor asked again for the man who rescued her, Amelia set down the chart and nodded softly. "You mean the veteran who brought you in? He left shortly after. He said he had to get to work." The disappointment struck Eleanor unexpectedly hard. Something about that man, his voice, his steadiness, his selflessness, lingered in her mind like a distant melody she knew but couldn't place. Amelia helped Eleanor sit up, fluffing the pillows behind her. "He didn't give his full name," Amelia continued, "but he stayed with you until he knew you were in safe hands." Eleanor's breathing steadied, but a strange ache formed in her chest. Not fear, not guilt, but a profound sense of unfinished fate. She pressed a hand to her forehead. "Did he appear harmed?" Amelia shook her head. Exhausted, soaked, but determined. Most people would have stayed to give a statement. He left because he felt responsible for being late to work. Eleanor's eyes widened. The idea that he rushed away, burdened, perhaps punished, for saving her made her stomach knot. She whispered, "He deserves better than that." A soft knock sounded at the door before a man stepped in carrying a small leather folder. This was Davis Whitlock, Eleanor's personal driver. Early 50s, tall, lean, with sandy gray hair neatly combed to the side. His rectangular glasses framed calm, observant eyes. Davis carried himself with the quiet professionalism of someone who had served people his whole life. He said, "Ma'am, I was discharged from the clinic earlier this morning. They told me you were awake. I came as soon as I could." Eleanor managed a faint smile. "Davis, I need your help." He immediately approached her bedside. "Whatever you require." Eleanor told him briefly, though still shaken, about the veteran who had rescued her. As she spoke, Davis listened with a mixture of concern and admiration. He had served as her driver for nearly 10 years and had always known her as a woman of grace, principles, and fierce loyalty. She rarely spoke with such intensity. "We must find him," she insisted. "He didn't just pull me from that wreck. He carried me through a nightmare I've never escaped. I owe him my life." Davis hesitated. "Ma'am, you need rest." But Eleanor shook her head, her voice steadier. "Rest can wait. Gratitude cannot." Amelia, overhearing, offered what little she knew. He mentioned heading to the harbor district, something called Warehouse 17. Eleanor exchanged a sharp look with Davis. The port area was dangerous, especially during storms. She felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of dread. "Take me there," she said firmly. Davis replied, "Yes, ma'am," without another question. Amelia tried to persuade Eleanor to stay until doctors discharged her, but Eleanor's resolve hardened. Trauma had shaped her life for 30 years. She knew the feeling of something terrible unfolding beyond sight. This wasn't worry. It was instinct. With Davis's help, Eleanor changed into a clean set of clothes someone had delivered earlier. A long beige coat, a soft cream turtleneck, and comfortable walking shoes. Her red wool coat, still smelling faintly of smoke, hung on a nearby rack, a visceral reminder of the night she survived. Eleanor studied it for a long moment, then whispered, "It would have ended there, if not for him." She draped the coat over her arm. Rex's familiar presence haunted her memory. The German shepherd's intelligent amber eyes, the gentle paw he had rested on her knee, and the uncanny recognition she'd felt. She shivered slightly, feeling something larger was at play. Davis guided her into a sleek black town car waiting outside the hospital entrance. Rain had slowed to a drizzle, and streaks of morning sunlight slipped through the clouds. As the car drove toward Coldwater Bay Harbor, the city faded into industrial steel and shipyard fog. Eleanor stared out the window, fingers gripping her coat tightly. She kept replaying the explosion, the warmth of Jim's arms shielding her, and the desperate look on his face as the SUV erupted behind them. "He risked everything," she whispered. Davis glanced at her in the rearview mirror, understanding more than she said. When the car reached the port district, Eleanor saw the towering stacks of containers, cranes creaking overhead, and workers pacing briskly in reflective vests. The air smelled of diesel and salt water. Warehouse 17 stood near the edge of the dock, a weather-beaten structure with chipped paint and industrial lights still flickering from the storm. As the car rolled to a halt, Eleanor felt the dread intensify. "Something has happened here," she murmured. She didn't know what, but the air carried tension like a storm, yet to break. Davis stepped out first, opening her door. Two workers unloading crates glanced curiously at the older woman stepping onto the wet asphalt in an elegant coat. Not a common sight in a port. Eleanor approached them gently. One of the men, a 20-year-old with messy blonde hair and pale skin, said, "Ma'am, can we help you?" She asked softly, "A veteran named Jim. Do you know him?" The young worker exchanged a grim look with his partner. "Yeah, we know him. He got fired last night." Eleanor felt her chest tighten sharply, the confirmation hitting like a blow. Fired for being late because he saved her. Another worker, Patrick Sloan, stepped forward. His salt and pepper beard framed a tired face, and his oil-stained gloves revealed long hours of labor. "Jim's a good man," Patrick said. "Didn't deserve what happened." Eleanor's voice trembled. "Where is he now?" Patrick pointed toward the eastern exit of the docks. "He left in the rain. Looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders." Eleanor whispered, "Oh, dear God." She suddenly understood why the ache in her chest hadn't faded. She wasn't just repaying a debt. She was being pulled toward the man who saved her because something in his life had begun to unravel. And she knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that she was meant to help him before it was too late. The drizzle had turned into a thin silver curtain by the time Eleanor Hayes stepped out of the sedan and onto the wet pavement of Coldwater Bay Harbor. Her red wool coat draped over her shoulders looked almost regal against the bleak industrial backdrop of shipping cranes and stacked containers. Workers paused mid-task, startled by the sight of a distinguished older woman in a place where refinery smoke usually drowned refinement. Eleanor, 65 years old, silver hair brushed neatly behind her ears, carried herself with unwavering purpose. Her heartbeat was faster than usual, not from fear, but from urgency, a sense that she was already too late. Davis Whitlock, her 52-year-old driver, walked behind her holding an umbrella with professional precision, scanning their surroundings. At the harbor's front checkpoint, a uniformed security guard stepped forward. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s named Greg Morton. Greg had a shaved head, thick black eyebrows, and a stern but fair expression softened by deep smile lines, suggesting years of friendly interaction with dock workers. His navy raincoat clung to him as he raised a hand. "Ma'am, you're not permitted in this zone without authorization." His voice was not unkind, but firm. Eleanor met his eyes with a calm, commanding presence, cultivated from years of philanthropy and leadership. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said. "I'm looking for a man named Jim Walker." Greg's brows lifted in surprise. He recognized the name, both of hers and Jim's. Greg hesitated before responding. "Jim Walker. He was here earlier, but he's gone now." Eleanor stepped closer. "And why is that?" Greg swallowed, uncomfortable with the truth he knew would upset her. "He was let go. Fired. Something about tardiness." Her eyes widened, a spark of disbelief giving way to simmering anger. Eleanor had lived through tragedy, battled depression after losing her family, and funded veteran support programs for years. But something about hearing that the man who saved her life was punished for doing so stirred a deeper fire inside her. "Fired," she repeated with a cold, sharp edge. "For saving me." Before Greg could explain further, two dock workers approached. The first was the young blonde worker who had spoken to her earlier. Ethan Brooks, 20, lanky, nervous with pale skin and freckles across his nose. He had the earnestness of someone unused to speaking to powerful people. The second was Patrick Sloan, mid-40s, rugged, bearded, and calm in demeanor. Ethan shifted awkwardly. "Ma'am, Jim's supervisor. He's not exactly a fair guy." Eleanor's gaze narrowed. "Frank Dalton," she said, recalling the name mentioned before. Patrick nodded gravely. Frank's been itching for a reason to get rid of him. Eleanor lifted her chin, steel growing in her posture. Where can I find this Frank? Greg, the guard, lifted a hand, nervously. Ma'am, confronting him might not be safe. Frank Dalton runs night operations. He's not known for manners. Eleanor responded with a chilling calmness. Neither are liars. Her red coat swayed as she strode past the checkpoint, leaving Greg momentarily speechless. Workers watched in awe as she cut across the harbor yard, her small figure dwarfed by industrial steel, but carrying an authority that cranes themselves seemed to bow to. Davis hurried behind her, umbrella tilted, eyes following her every move in case she stumbled. But Eleanor moved with the steadiness of a woman driven by justice. Warehouse 17 sat ahead under the glow of floodlights, metal siding still dripping from the night's storm. As Eleanor approached, the massive sliding door opened, and Frank Dalton stepped out. He wore a reflective vest stretched tight over his stomach, and his thinning blonde hair was plastered to his forehead from sweat rather than rain. His face, square jaw, red cheeks, twisted in annoyance as he spotted people gathering. Frank was a man hardened not by loss, but by insecurity. Years ago, he'd applied for a managerial promotion in another district and had been rejected. Ever since, he ruled his crew with bitterness, hiding his inadequacy behind authority. Seeing Eleanor made him pause. "Can I help you?" Eleanor stopped a few steps before him, her eyes sharp as glass. "Are you Frank Dalton?" Frank straightened defensively. "Yes." "And you are?" She tilted her chin slightly. "The woman whose life Jim Walker saved last night." A flash of discomfort crossed Frank's face. Murmurs spread among nearby workers who had trickled closer, sensing a confrontation worth witnessing. Frank forced a scoff. "Ma'am, that's unfortunate, but it's unrelated to company policy. The man was late. Rules are rules." Eleanor took one step closer, her voice dropping to a tone that sliced through the harbor noise. "Rules without humanity are nothing but excuses for cruelty." Frank's face flushed a deeper red. "Look, lady." "Mrs. Hayes," she corrected icily. Frank stammered. "Mrs. Hayes, this is a workplace issue. You don't have the authority to intervene." Eleanor's lips curled in something between amusement and contempt. "I fund 1/3 of the Coldwater Bay Veterans Assistance Program," she said calmly, "a program this port benefits from, and Warehouse 17 receives annual subsidies under my name for veteran employment." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Frank blinked, suddenly pale. Eleanor added, "And you fired a veteran for saving my life?" Every word echoed like a gavel strike. One of the senior foremen, Harold Pierce, stepped out from the background. He was in his 60s, tall, with white hair tucked under a navy cap, and he carried the dignified demeanor of a man who had worked the docks his entire life. He had a scar on his jaw from an accident years ago that made him speak slowly but with authority. "Mrs. Hayes," he greeted warmly, clearly recognizing her. "If there's been a wrongful termination, we can review it." Frank glared at him, but Harold didn't flinch. Eleanor nodded once. "Good. Then here is my message." She faced the entire group, her voice unwavering. "I am calling for an emergency meeting with port management tomorrow at dawn. Every decision concerning Jim Walker will be reviewed publicly." Frank tried to recover his footing, shaking his head. "You can't just demand a meeting." "I already have," Eleanor replied. She gestured toward Davis, who handed her a sleek leather folder containing documentation, proof of her foundation's involvement in port funding. Frank's jaw tightened, his bravado evaporating under the weight of undeniable influence. Workers around them stood straighter, some exchanging vindicated smiles. For years, Frank's authority had been unchecked. Now, It trembled beneath the fury of a woman he had underestimated. Eleanor closed the folder and stepped back. "You used your position to humiliate a man who risked his life for others. That ends tomorrow." Frank's expression contorted with a mixture of fear and resentment. But the crowd didn't sympathize. Patrick Sloan murmured, "About time someone put him in his place." Ethan nodded vigorously. Harold simply tipped his cap to Eleanor. The older woman lifted her red coat against the breeze. "Thank you, gentlemen. Justice is long overdue." As she turned toward the car, Davis matched her pace. Behind them, the harbor buzzed with the electricity of change. The sky had begun to clear, pale gold spreading over the horizon as Eleanor reached the sedan. She paused beside the door, gripping it for support. Davis leaned in. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She nodded slowly. "I am. Now. Tomorrow morning we make this right." With one last look at the warehouse, Eleanor Hayes stepped into the car, no longer a victim of last night's storm, but the storm that was coming for anyone who wronged Jim Walker. Jim Walker drove through the quiet forest road toward his cabin, exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders. The storm had faded into a misty drizzle, leaving the pine trees glistening under the pale moon. Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and sharp amber eyes, sat alert in the passenger seat. Jim's worn military cold-weather parka was still damp from rain and confrontation. He pulled into his gravel driveway, headlights sweeping across the clearing. Only then did he notice something unusual. A shadowy figure crouched near the rear of his truck. Jim's senses sharpened. He turned off the engine silently. Rex's ears perked, hackles rising, recognizing danger before Jim even whispered the command. Jim stepped out quietly, boots sinking into wet soil. The shadow jerked upright, startled, and the beam of the porch light revealed Frank Dalton. The night shift supervisor looked panicked, his thinning blonde hair plastered to his forehead with sweat despite the cold air. Frank held a phone in one trembling hand, having just taken photos of Jim's vehicle. His reflective vest glimmered faintly. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jim demanded, voice steady but dangerous. Frank stumbled backward. "Stay back, I was just checking something," he stammered. Jim took another step. Rex growled, deep and low. Frank panicked, turned, and bolted into the woods. In his frantic escape, something slipped from his pocket and clattered onto the gravel. Small, metallic, important. Jim waited until Frank's crashing footsteps disappeared into the darkness. Then he knelt and picked up the object. A black USB drive, scratched on one side, labeled with a red sticker that read W17 Ops footage. Rex sniffed it, whining softly. Jim's instincts tightened. He had seen fear on many faces, on many battlegrounds. But Frank's panic wasn't the fear of a guilty man. It was the fear of a man whose plan was collapsing. Jim put the USB into his pocket, ushered Rex toward the cabin, and locked the door behind them. Inside, the place was dimly lit by a single lamp. Jim sat at the wooden table, the USB lying beside his calloused hands. "Let's see what you were so desperate to hide," he muttered. He inserted the USB into an old laptop. A folder popped up instantly, containing several video clips labeled by dates and timestamps inside Warehouse 17. Jim clicked the first file. The footage showed him in the warehouse during a normal shift, but something was off. The sequence glitched unnaturally, then abruptly jumped to a scene of a forklift crashing into a pallet stack, an incident that never happened. Another clip showed crates falling dangerously near workers, and the video had him superimposed near the danger zone. Jim's jaw tightened. The editing was sloppy, but credible enough for someone unfamiliar with warehouse operations. "He was building a case," Jim whispered. Rex whined again, leaning closer as though sensing, Jim's rising tension. Jim opened the next file. This one was more concerning. Audio distortion layered beneath the fake video. A strange, high-pitched pulse repeated at intervals, barely audible but unmistakable. Rex reacted instantly, ears flattening and then standing tall, pacing in agitation. Jim froze. The sound triggered a memory he had long buried. During deployment overseas, psychological warfare units had used similar frequencies to manipulate emotional reactions in combat zones, triggering anxiety, fear, or disorientation. The military abandoned them due to ethical violations. The fact that this audio appeared in warehouse footage was more than suspicious. It was intentional. Someone wanted the videos to provoke a negative instinctive reaction in anyone reviewing them. Jim whispered, "This wasn't just a setup. This was engineered." Rex placed a paw on Jim's knee, his amber eyes fixed on the laptop screen. Jim stroked his fur absently as he replayed the audio, analyzing every nuance. The pulse had a pattern: 3 beats, a pause, then a long hum. Exactly the same as one notorious psychological tactic used to undermine the credibility of soldiers exhibiting high-alert behavior. Jim leaned back, the weight of truth hitting him. Frank Dalton hadn't just wanted to fire him. Frank wanted to portray him as dangerous, unstable, a liability. "He wants me destroyed," Jim murmured. Rex barked once, a sharp, decisive sound, almost as if affirming the conclusion. Jim continued through the USB files. Clip after clip showed escalating fabrications, equipment sabotaged, workers endangered, rules ignored. Each one digitally manipulated to place blame on him. Jim recognized some backgrounds and dates, moments he wasn't even on shift. Someone had gone through immense effort to construct an entire narrative of incompetence and danger. Jim's military training had honed his ability to spot inconsistencies, lighting changes, misaligned shadows, camera angles inconsistent with the port's fixed CCTV. This wasn't the work of someone careless. This was the work of someone who had planned every detail. "Why, Frank?" Jim asked under his breath. "Why go this far?" There was another file, hidden inside a secondary folder. Its title was W17 Admin Notes. Jim opened it and found a text log, unfiltered and incriminating. It contained Frank's voice-to-text memos, hateful remarks about veterans, resentment over losing authority, envy of Jim's respect among workers, and worst of all, confirmation that Frank had been coordinating with an unknown outsider to push Jim out. One entry read, "If I make the vet look unstable, management won't question termination. He'll be gone before anyone notices." Jim's fists clenched. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It was personal, and the involvement of someone outside the port suggested a deeper threat. Rex suddenly walked to the window, ears perked, staring into the dark tree line. Jim joined him, scanning the silent forest. No movement. But Rex lingering there meant something, or someone, had been nearby recently. Jim locked the laptop, pocketed the USB, and whispered, "We're not safe here." At that moment, headlights flashed briefly in the distance on the forest road, then vanished. The cabin remained quiet, but the stillness felt too deliberate. Jim knew danger when he felt it. Someone was watching. And Frank Dalton wasn't working alone. Back inside, Jim sat at the kitchen table again, hands steepled as he processed the truth. Frank had engineered a false narrative using doctored footage and psychological audio triggers. Someone else had supplied technology far beyond a dock supervisor's abilities. Jim's reputation, his employment, and possibly his safety were being targeted. He looked at Rex, who sat tall and unwavering. "We'll fight this," Jim said, "but we'll need help." He thought of Eleanor Hayes, determined, influential, fearless. She had already confronted Frank. She deserved to know the full truth. Jim slid the USB into his pocket. Tomorrow, everything would begin to unravel. The morning sun painted Coldwater Bay Harbor in muted gold as fog drifted slowly across the docks. The management building, a glass and steel office perched above the yard, reflected the rising light like a watchtower. Jim Walker walked toward it with steady, disciplined strides, Rex at his side. Jim's military cold-weather parka was zipped to his collarbone, the thick fabric shielding him from the cool morning breeze. His expression was calm, but sharpened by purpose. Rex, 4 years old with a sable coat and bright amber eyes, moved like a trained guardian soldier, head high, tail low, every sense alert. They paused at the glass entrance where Eleanor Hayes waited, elegant in a gray wool coat, her silver hair neatly brushed, her face determined. Inside the lobby, the port staff stared with mixed awe and curiosity. They knew something unprecedented was unfolding. Eleanor stepped forward, offering Jim a reassuring nod. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Jim responded with a respectful incline of his head. "Yes, ma'am." Behind the reception desk stood Marissa Coe, a 40-year-old administrator with sleek black hair tied in a low bun, wearing a charcoal blazer. Marissa glanced nervously at the schedule on her tablet. "The board is waiting," she said, her tone professional but tense. She gestured toward the elevators. Rex followed closely, nails clicking softly against the polished floor. They entered the conference room on the top floor. The long glass table, rimmed with steel, reflected the anxious faces of the harbor's leadership. The room smelled faintly of ink and fresh coffee. Sitting at the head was Robert Hensley, 63 years old, the harbor director, tall, thin, with a neatly trimmed white beard and round spectacles. His demeanor was usually diplomatic, but today was marked with irritation and confusion. To his right sat Lydia Grant, a 50-year-old HR manager with short auburn hair and sharp cheekbones. She was known for her strict adherence to protocol. On the left was Mark Devereaux, 45, legal counsel, clean-shaven, with calculating gray eyes. All three looked up as Eleanor, Jim, and Rex entered, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Frank Dalton was already in the room, sitting alone near the far wall. His thinning blonde hair was disheveled, his reflective vest replaced with a wrinkled shirt. Sweat dotted his forehead as he tapped his foot uncontrollably. He looked like a man on the edge of collapse. When the door opened, Frank flinched, eyes darting between Jim and Eleanor. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Eleanor took her seat calmly, placing her folder on the table with deliberate precision. Jim sat beside her, while Rex lay at his feet like a silent sentinel. The room quieted. Director Hensley cleared his throat. "We are here to address allegations concerning Mr. Jim Walker's termination and potential misconduct within Warehouse 17. His eyes shifted to Eleanor. "Mrs. Hayes has requested this meeting and stated she has new evidence." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, and what I have concerns not only Jim Walker's innocence, but the integrity of this port." She gestured toward Jim. He opened his parka slightly and removed the USB drive. The room leaned forward. Jim spoke calmly, voice steady like a soldier briefing his unit. "Last night, Frank Dalton trespassed on my property and dropped this. What's inside explains everything." Jim inserted the USB into the conference room projector port. The screen lit up with the first doctored video clip. Gasps filled the room. The forklift collision appeared, poorly edited, shadows mismatched, timestamps inconsistent. Lydia Grant frowned deeply. "This footage, The background light changes mid-scene. Mark Devereaux leaned closer. This isn't raw security footage. This is manipulated. Jim clicked through more clips. Pallets falling, altered audio, false timestamps. Rex growled softly each time the psychological trigger sound played. Director Hensley pushed back in his seat, appalled. This is criminal fabrication. Jim explained the audio distortion, how the hidden frequency resembled psychological triggers used in military operations. Eleanor added, Jim saved my life, and instead of honoring a veteran who risked everything, Frank tried to destroy him. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. The room turned to Frank Dalton. His face had drained of color. You don't know what you're talking about, Frank sputtered. He was reckless. He endangered my team. Lydia folded her arms. Do you have proof? Frank's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with panic. The footage speaks for itself, Jim calmly countered. Footage you created. Director Hensley stood, pacing. Frank, explain these inconsistencies. Why did you go to Mr. Walker's home last night? Frank shook his head rapidly. I didn't. I was checking something for work, Jim replied evenly. Warehouse 17 doesn't conduct checks in the forest at midnight. Mark Devereaux pulled up the audio logs found in the USB's hidden folder. Frank's voice-to-text memos appeared on screen. Derogatory statements about veterans, resentment toward Jim, and confirmation he intended to fabricate misconduct to justify firing him. The room erupted. Lydia covered her mouth. Marissa at the door gasped. Frank dropped his head into his hands. Director Hensley looked devastated. Frank Dalton, you have violated multiple ethical, legal, and professional protocols. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation. Frank shot to his feet. You can't do this. He's a nobody. A washed-up soldier. Rex sprang up, barking sharply, startling him into silence. Jim placed a calming hand on Rex's head. The board members stared in frozen disbelief at Frank's outburst. Lydia spoke quietly. Mr. Dalton, please remove yourself from this room. Security escorted him out, trembling and defeated. The tension dissolved once Frank was gone. Eleanor turned toward Jim with a warm, grateful smile. You are vindicated, she said softly. Director Hensley nodded. Jim Walker, on behalf of Coldwater Bay Harbor, we apologize for the wrongful termination and the mistreatment you endured. Lydia added, You will be reinstated immediately with full benefits, along with an official statement clearing your name. Jim exhaled slowly, letting a weight lift from his shoulders. Rex wagged his tail, sensing the shift. Mark Devereaux leaned forward. And we will pursue legal action. This level of calculated deception cannot be ignored. The board's mood shifted from shock to quiet admiration. Eleanor rested a hand on Rex's head. And this brave guardian, she said, helped reveal the truth. He recognized what many ignored. Lydia smiled gently. Rex is quite the hero. Jim glanced at his companion, warmth filling his eyes. He always has been. Director Hensley concluded, If Jim is willing, we would like him to assist in improving warehouse safety protocols. His military experience would be invaluable. Jim hesitated. He had never sought recognition. But for the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as a broken veteran, but as someone who still mattered. He nodded. I'd be honored. The meeting adjourned, and sunlight poured through the glass windows as if the harbor itself approved of the justice delivered. Eleanor, Jim, and Rex walked out together. Workers below watched through windows as the trio descended the stairs, Rex leading with confident strides, Jim steady beside him, Eleanor elegant and resolute. The truth had prevailed, and the next chapter of Jim's life was just beginning. The morning after the fateful meeting, Coldwater Bay Harbor was wrapped in a calm brightness that seemed almost symbolic, as if the storms of the previous days had finally released their hold. A soft breeze rolled in from the water, carrying the scent of salt and diesel. Jim Walker walked along the dock beside Rex, who moved with relaxed confidence, his sable coat glowing in the early sun. Jim was still processing everything that had happened: the rescue, the betrayal, the meeting, the restoration of his honor. But he had not expected what Eleanor Hayes would propose next. When he approached Warehouse 17, he found her waiting, dressed in a long navy wool coat, her silver hair shining. She looked energized, purposeful, as though today marked the beginning of something new. Eleanor greeted him with a warm but determined nod. "Jim," she said, "there's something we need to discuss." She gestured toward the now quiet warehouse. The massive steel doors loomed behind her, their faded numbers casting long shadows on the concrete. Rex sniffed the ground, circling near them before settling at Jim's feet. Eleanor's expression softened as she looked at the dog. "Rex has a presence," she said quietly, "a calm strength. You both do." Jim listened intently, sensing the weight behind her words. Eleanor continued, "Yesterday showed me not only who you are, but what this place could become. There are too many veterans slipping through the cracks, alone, forgotten. We can change that." She motioned for Jim to follow her inside. Warehouse 17 felt different now, less like the site of conflict and more like an opportunity waiting to be shaped. Sunlight streamed through dusty skylights, illuminating old wooden pallets and unused machinery. Eleanor walked with a steady, confident stride, her cane tapping lightly on the concrete. "I've been silent for too long," she said. "After losing my husband and my son, I withdrew from the world. But seeing you risk your life for me, seeing how you carry yourself, it reminded me of the men they once were. Brave, unbreakable, and it reminded me of my responsibility." Jim felt emotion stir in his chest. He didn't interrupt. At the far end of the warehouse stood a desk, worn but sturdy. Eleanor placed her hand on it. "I want to transform this place," she declared. "Warehouse 17 should become the Coldwater Veterans Support Center, a place to offer food, temporary shelter, job training, and counseling." She looked at Jim with eyes full of conviction. "There are dozens of veterans in this harbor town, men who served, came home, and never found their footing again. Some sleeping under bridges, some wandering with no purpose. This center would give them what the world hasn't, a second chance." Jim felt Rex press gently against his leg, sensing the shift in the air. Eleanor stepped closer to Jim, her expression unwavering. "But a center like this needs leadership. Someone who understands discipline, compassion, and what it means to rebuild from nothing." Her gaze softened even further. "Jim, I want you to run it." Jim blinked in surprise. Of all the things he thought she might say, this was nowhere on the list. He shook his head slowly. "Eleanor, I'm no administrator. I'm just a man trying to get by." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "You're far more than that. Your record, your service, your loyalty, your integrity, everything about you says you're meant to guide others. And besides," she looked down at Rex, "you won't be doing it alone." Jim stared at the empty warehouse floor, imagining rows of beds, a kitchen, training areas, and veterans sitting together rather than wandering alone. He imagined laughter returning to men who had forgotten what it sounded like. He imagined the possibility of hope. Rex nudged his hand, amber eyes glowing with encouragement. Jim took a long breath. "If I do this," he said quietly, "I want to do it right." Eleanor nodded firmly. "And you will." She paused, studying him with a tenderness that carried the weight of years lost. "Your courage saved my life, Jim. This is my way of honoring that. My way of making sure others like you aren't left behind." As they walked back toward the entrance, a new figure appeared. Martin Cole, a middle-aged contractor with a thick beard peppered with gray, broad shoulders and rough hands cracked from years of physical labor. He wore a faded flannel shirt and steel-toe boots. Eleanor introduced him. "Jim, this is Martin. He's the best contractor in Coldwater. I asked him to stop by and give us an estimate." Martin extended a strong, calloused hand. "Heard a lot about you, Walker. Sounds like you've been through hell and back." His voice carried a gravelly warmth, the tone of someone who had seen hardship but refused to be hardened by it. Jim shook his hand firmly. Rex sniffed Martin approvingly. Martin walked the warehouse with professional eyes, assessing beams, insulation, wiring. "This place is old," he said, "but it's got good bones. Give me a couple weeks, and it'll look brand new." Jim felt a strange mixture of excitement and responsibility rise inside him. Martin glanced over his shoulder. "And if you're running this place," he added, "the veterans in this town are lucky." Jim wasn't used to compliments, but he nodded gratefully. Eleanor clasped her hands together. "Then it's settled. Construction begins next week." Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with emotion. "Coldwater needs this, and so do I." Outside, workers on the dock watched curiously as Jim, Eleanor, and Martin stood discussing the transformation of Warehouse 17. Word had spread fast. Many knew Jim's story, his service, his struggle, the injustice he endured. Seeing him stand tall now, beside a woman who was once trapped in a burning SUV, made people whisper things like destiny and fate. Rex stood proudly in front of Jim, tail swaying, embodying the strength and loyalty that had carried them through storm and fire. A forklift operator passing by raised a hand. "Good to have you back, Walker," another worker chimed in. "Warehouse 17's gonna shine again." Eleanor turned to Jim one last time. "You gave me my life back," she said softly. "Let me help restore yours, and many others." Jim looked out over the harbor, where sunlight danced across the waves. He thought of the night the storm raged, of the SUV engulfed in flames, of Rex pulling at his sleeve, urging him to move. A single decision had connected three strangers on a road of fire and rain, and now that same road was leading to something greater. Jim placed his hand on Rex's head. "We'll do it," he said, "for the ones who need it. For the ones who never got a second chance." Eleanor's eyes glistened. As the wind shifted and seabirds called overhead, Jim felt the weight of his past begin to settle into something steadier. Purpose. The kind he hadn't felt since leaving the military. Warehouse 17 would no longer be the site of false accusations or betrayal. It would become a sanctuary, a foundation, a home. And from that day forward, Coldwater Harbor would speak of the night that changed everything with a reverence close to miracle. They called it simply the miracle at Warehouse 17. In life, miracles don't always arrive in blazing light. They often come quietly through the people God places in our path at the exact moment we need them most. Jim, Rex, and Eleanor showed that a single act of kindness can change the fate of 3 lives, and that God always guides those who keep goodness in their hearts. May this story remind us to believe in grace, compassion, and the gentle miracles hidden in everyday moments. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to help us spread more hope. May God bless you and protect you and your family in every step ahead.